I think as practitioners now, the responsibility, I think, as you mentioned, have increased. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're a practitioner working within football. I think if it was maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a lot of your work would be player facing, and you would be working maybe with a chef, and you'd be working with other members of the multidisciplinary team, doctor, psychologists, physio, S&C, biomechanics, sports science. But now this team is extended. You might be dealing with agents, more and more. You might be dealing more and more with partners. You'll be dealing with club and player liaison officers. You might be dealing with architects for the structure of new parts of training grounds. You'll be dealing with a bigger chef team. You might be dealing with the CEO. You might be dealing with the exec team commercially, legal team. So actually your skill set now, you're being pushed and pulled away from traditionally what we're taught through degrees and postgraduate degrees, which is ultimately working with the athlete. And a lot more of these conversations are a lot more commercial in nature. And there's not a lot of things that prepare you for these. So at times, I really believe believe strongly that you need someone just to run through the examples with, to test and to see how they would apply it.
Well, very warm welcome to the podcast, James. How are you today?
Steve, I'm keeping really well. I'm just down in London as we have this conversation. Slightly overcast and a bit chilly, but I'm keeping well, and it's really nice to be on here.
Oh, it's so good to connect, James. How long have we known each other? I don't know, maybe nearly 20 years or so, but so enjoyed working with you a long time ago now. I'm keen to ask you about what you're up to at the moment with your new venture, INTRA. It's probably not so new now, is it? You've been working away at that for a while. But it'd be remiss of me not to tap into your rich experience and insights. So before we go any further, just give us a bit of a background to you, how you got into the area, some of your experiences.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve. I'm probably going to start back at when we first got to know each other, right? So I started my work as a practitioner, as a sports nutritionist, started with the UK Sports Institute, obviously formerly to us, known as the EIS. And that was back in 2006. So I was actually quite fortunate, if I look back on it, Steve, because I just finished my master's in sports nutrition at Loughborough. And thinking back to the time there, and I'm sure it was similar for you in physiology, the amount of positions that were available within sports nutrition, physiology, and maybe even sports science, especially when Olympic sports then, were really limited. And UK Sport did this fast track program where they fast tracked you in a year. And I worked within the UK Sports Institute then. And my first sport was track and field. And obviously that's when we worked together. And I remember us meeting over a few athletes at Loughborough and discussing strategies for some of the middle distance runners, which was great. I really enjoyed that first year. And if I'm honest, Steve, that being my first sport, athletics, I really enjoyed it from a nutrition perspective because it was so pure, it was so measurable. And I like the variety of being down in Lee Valley, working with the sprinters and, using nutrition to affect strength, affect muscle mass and, explosive power. That was great. And likewise, some of the athletes we were talking about, we were looking at endurance as well and looking at the nutrition considerations there. So I think for me, that was my first step, I think both as a practitioner, but as a sport within track and field. And I worked with them through the Beijing 2008 Olympic cycle, and that was an interesting one for us, and stayed within the institute up towards 2010. And at that time, the job came up at Arsenal. And I guess many years ago, I used to play football. That was my main interest. So for me to go into a club, I was really interested in that. They had a really interesting structure. And I joined in 2010 and spent 7 seasons developing the nutrition service within the club. So my role initially was as first team nutritionist, and then we grew the service out for the women's team, for the academy, and right across the athletic development pathway. And I really enjoyed that role. And at the time, it was really about embedding a nutrition service within a team, which was a very good team in terms of doctor, physiotherapy, sports science, but there was no nutrition previously. And, it had to find its way and find its place, both within the multidisciplinary team, but also engaging the players as well. So that was another challenge. We might come back to that. But stayed there for 7 seasons, and along the way consulted with England 2014 World Cup. One of the most unsuccessful, Steve, if I'm really honest. There's lots of learnings there. I think it's important to be transparent about these things. And then with France, which was better, consulted with them at 2018 World Cup. And I guess for me along the way, and with some of our meetings, Steve, one of my passions has always been the work within elite sport, which I've loved, but I've always wanted to have one foot outside of elite sport. So at the time, I had a private practice in Harley Street as part of the Centre for Health and Human Performance. And essentially at that time, we were really taking a lot of the work with practitioners in sport and applying it to the everyday consumer, the weekend warrior. We had business people coming through, we had musicians, we had people doing Latat, people doing Aconcagua, those doing Marathon des Sables. So some really interesting challenges to use nutrition within then. And that sort of led me really, coming full circle to this, Steve, in 2019 to set up INTRA Performance Group. And that's where we are today. And my passion has always really been to have a team working on different projects, but also collaborating as a team. And I guess INTRA Performance Group today, we're London-based, but we work internationally. And we work probably in 3 key strands. The first one is we work with individual talent. And I say talent quite deliberately because we have individual elite athletes, footballers from the top 5 European leagues, musicians and business executives, and we provide year-round support to them as individuals. The second is we work with organizations. So historically, we would embed practitioners within organizations. So we had a 4-year project running with Chelsea, embedding the practitioners there, embedding them within different sports, and more recently working with different corporate organizations to put on programs year round to, I guess, improve the corporate well-being outcomes for the different staff within these organizations. And the third one is research and development. And we do different work with confederations such as UEFA and national federations as well, to help them answer different performance-related questions as well and help them provide solutions to those. So that's pretty much where we are today, Steve. And I won't go on for too much longer, but hopefully that frames a little bit with some of my interests and INTRA as well.
Love that. So there's been such an interesting and varied, but progressing, ever-changing demands on you. How do you conduct your nutrition in your life? I'm always curious to this because I succumb to training mistakes that I would never allow in athletes that I work with. But when you're thinking about your own nutrition, if you've got a particular vice, or are you monk-like, and that you're a Puritan, that you would never transgress?
Well, you know what, Steve? The first thing I would say, I definitely have vices. And I actually think it's really important to have those. And especially within sports, I think it's really important to show those to athletes as well. And I think definitely within nutrition, maybe less so within sports. Nutrition can almost be seen as this perfect discipline where, we're eating healthily all the time. But actually, the reality is sometimes it's, things are quite messy and we want people to eat in a way which is quite functional. So it's about results. And I think there's nothing more important maybe within the sport when you're eating with the athletes, to show them that, at times you'll have a pudding, or at times that, you're open to wider experiences around food. And I think that humanizes what we do. I don't want to bridge your answer too much because the question you're asking about my vices, so for sure, I've got a sweet tooth. So for me, pastry at the weekend, pan au chocolat, that's just, it's just
stop it.
Yeah.
It's mid-morning. I'm getting hungry listening to that. And how do you manage that? Do you have a way of sort of capping, controlling, or limiting? Can I get into your specific own personal tactic there?
So what I would say is, my own personal tactic, I would have a rhythm to my week. And I probably use rhythm as the right expression where, what we're not talking about is it being ultra prescriptive, but I have different principles about how I'll fuel different days. For example, for me, just like I would say, to my clients. So, on days where I'm training, or maybe running and doing some weights, I'll eat slightly differently to on days where I might be a bit more desk bound. I mean, interestingly for me, I've just taken up Pilates, Steve, reformer Pilates on Saturday, which I'm absolutely loving, by the way. I'm a huge advocate. And, for us, there's a social element to this too. So we have a group that will do that. And for us, it's about having a coffee, having a pastry, and actually getting together after the session as well. So I think, in answer to your question, building the different treats and building things in socially is really important to me. And I think to a lot of our clients as well, whether it's family meal times being together, whether it's teammates being together, or whether it's co-workers, I think food plays such an important part for us as individuals and, our culture that, it's really important we acknowledge that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, cycling at the weekend with friends for 3 hours, and I'm always a little bit surprised. I come back and I'm a bit heavier maybe from a 3 hour ride. Maybe too many coffees or cakes, but that as a destination, it feels actually as though it's sort of becoming acceptable as part of that social experience. Talking to a number of people about this idea of ways in which we can increase the habits, improve the affinity with physical exercise, and one of those being a social connection too. So I love that example.
It's a really interesting point, Steve. And I think as we're coming towards New Year now as well, I think one of the most interesting things around with people making changes, don't we? We'll have a lot of clients, I'm sure, that we're making dietary changes in the New Year, exercise programs, and just that. I think that reminder to, one, make it fun, but also to, trying to make it social where possible, right? Like you were saying about the weekend ride, like I'm saying about the group that I do at the weekends, it makes such a difference in terms of that sticking.
Yeah. And so, did it always feel for you back in the day, 2006, 10 years after I'd sort of started? So I sort of tripped into the industry. Um, I had a background of applying my knowledge. Um, 2006, we were sort of on that upward journey. The Olympics had been awarded in London. And what do you think, looking back, meant that in a pool of a small number of practitioners that might be viable as employable prospects, what separated you out from the rest? What allowed you to sort of take the opportunity of those trainee intern programs at the time?
Wow, it's a really good question, Steve. I think there's probably a couple of things. So I think I think there was a life experience element of this, and probably something that's removed from technical knowledge with nutrition. So actually, one I don't often talk a lot about is previously, so I went to Loughborough and did my undergrad there, but prior to that, I was in the US on a soccer scholarship. So I left when I was 18, went straight out to upstate New York, didn't really know what I was getting into, and sort of threw myself into this experience. And if I'm honest, at that time, that was probably where I had my first exposure deeply with nutrition, because within collegiate sport, that was already embedded. It was part of the conversation a little bit. And not only did I just love the collegiate sport side, I came back, it really sort of took me on this journey. It also, the light came on a little bit with nutrition. So I think there was an element of that, alongside my work, I did football coaching as well, and got a couple of my coaching badges. So one of the things that I was learning at the time was just how to communicate with athletes, how to learn how to communicate as a coach, how to structure a session, and how to change this session and be open to different types of feedback. So I think actually when I was going for this interview for the fast track program, and you're totally right, at the time, there were lots of people going for these positions because the only reason they were created was because of the funding, right, for 2012. So we're incredibly fortunate. But I remember drawing on the experiences, and actually at that time, the depth of experience within nutrition was relatively limited. So, rightly or wrongly, at that time, I was drawing on these different experiences interpersonally, having a process maybe with coaching, and giving some examples here. I think on the other side, Steve, as well, and this is again being really transparent. when I was doing my MSc at Loughborough, we had our project during the summer. You probably remember this as well, right? You're writing these up during doing your dissertation. And I think at that time, I remember thinking, well, at the end of this year, I'm going to be applying for jobs. I really need to get some deep exposure quite quickly, and was really open to turning my hand at anything. I remember, do you remember Loughborough Sports, where there would be the opportunity to work with the different teams on campus? So threw myself into that. Initially, it was a few presentations, really just feeling what felt right. Again, getting some, really good feedback. And I think I remember at the time, Kate Goodger was involved in that as well, who's obviously a prominent psychologist. And, I remember distinctly that was interesting. But at the time, I remember going up to Blackburn Rovers. And this was at a time where Tony Strudwick was in post at Blackburn Rovers, who, wind the clock forward 14 years later, we were working in England together in Brazil. But at that time, he was looking for some support. And I said, look, I'll do it. I'll come up there. And I went up there a couple of days a week, stayed over. And it was just the best learning experience, Steve, because initially, within a club environment, going in as a practitioner, I had no concept of how it ran, no concept of what other team members were looking like, absolutely no concept really of interdisciplinary support, and how to link your service to strength and conditioning, to medical as well. And I think it was those experiences, and I really enjoyed that work, and that kind of gave me some momentum going into this interview. And I was already making mistakes and learning, and I was enjoying my journey as well. And I had some good examples to give. And I'd be interested in your thought on this, Steve, as well. And I think when you're younger as a practitioner, and this was definitely true for me in the early years at the Institute, you're pretty fearless. I think at that time, you probably don't know what you don't know. And this is probably linked to the Dunning-Kruger effect and other things as well. But it's an interesting time. So you're really cavalier, but I think in a way, sometimes you need that momentum to get you in the door of places to help sell your service. But a long-winded answer. Yeah, those are just a few points.
It's a delicate one, isn't it? Of having the energy and the confidence to knock on doors to say, yeah, I can do that. But not to the point where it's arrogant or I'm going to solve the world. Don't you know what I've learned at various universities? That sense of overconfidence, but incompetent. The confidence to try, but not necessarily to present themselves as the all-seeing, omniscient, omnipotent practitioner.
So true. Yeah, it's so true, and there's such a balance to be had there, isn't there?
You mentioned mistakes. When I think this is such an important part of growing as a practitioner, and I don't think it goes away because it's important to always learn and review and reflect. But the tolerance for mistakes. I'm curious to know what your perspective is now for emerging practitioners, people who you might be thinking, right, I want to put you in front of a client. Yeah. The margin for error seems to be getting tighter. I'd be keen to get your thoughts as to whether, do you have that sort of perfectionist streak of thinking, right, that practitioner has to be 100% ready to go before we let them go, or does it have some learning potential in there?
Wow, that's a really interesting point, Steve. So how I deliberately set things up at INTRA was having technical support, and that really runs through. And again, this is almost going back to learning, Stephen. And one of the things that I was seeing, especially within football, and this is something we picked up on with our work with UEFA as well, speaking to different clubs across Europe. A lot of the feedback we're getting is that nutritionists can work in silo, especially junior nutritionists going in, because if it's your first role, and let's say a football club's advertising, you're looking for a foot in the door, as you mentioned. So you start the process, but you might not have the full understanding about how to work in an interdisciplinary way. So a lot of your work can be conducted in silo. So it might be delivered to players, but it might not be as interdisciplinary as you'd like it. And you might not have the supervision. And the supervision is just a really important thing. And I think we can all think of instances throughout our career where you're going to have things that really test you. And you need someone to be able to share thoughts with and to get some technical support. So much so, Steve, I have technical support now. I think it's so important. You're never too old for it. I think it's really important to have meetings monthly with people to discuss technical cases. Now, for me now, the technical cases that I discuss might be less as a practitioner and they might be more as a business professional, perhaps. But, this is still really important. I think the other thing linked to this as well, Steve, is that I think as practitioners now, the responsibility, I think, as you mentioned, have increased. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're a practitioner working within football. I think if it was maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a lot of your work would be player facing and you would be working maybe with a chef and you'd be working with other members of the multidisciplinary team, doctor, psychologist, physio, S&C, biomechanics, sports science. But now this team is extended. You might be dealing with agents, more and more. You might be dealing more and more with partners. You'll be dealing with club and player liaison officers. You might be dealing with architects for the structure of new parts of training grounds. You'll be dealing with a bigger chef team. You might be dealing with the CEO. You might be dealing with the exec team commercially, legal team. So actually your skill set now, you're being pushed and pulled away from traditionally what we're taught through degrees and postgraduate degrees, which is ultimately working with the athlete. And a lot more of these conversations are a lot more commercial in nature. And there's not a lot of things that prepare you for these. So at times, I really believe I believe strongly that you need someone just to run through the examples with, to test and to see how they would apply it. And we try and do a similar thing with INTRA, really, Steve, in that the practitioners that we have, for sure, there's a development curve here. And what I tend to do is work very closely with our practitioners early on and the team work together just to try and get the way of working. So our ethos around how we apply support, how we apply our programs, so that we're all really well aligned. Because you're definitely right. The one thing we would never do is put a practitioner in to see an athlete until we were really comfortable that they understood our organization, our ethos, how we apply. And I think then it's really just about almost graded exposure to a degree. And I think we tend to sometimes double up on clients as well, where there'll be a senior or technical support member and a practitioner. And these different levels of service actually help to protect the practitioner slightly, but also help to give some confidence both to the practitioner and to the client as well. But having these different levels of support for us are extremely important. And I think whether you're working within a consultancy, within an organization, I think having some technical support or mentorship is just so crucial. I'm really interested in your thoughts on that, Steve, as well. How are you seeing things, with sports science performance practitioners?
Can I ask you another question before I answer? Because I don't want to infect your answer. Because you've demonstrated, or you've mentioned your initiative, your industry as a student. That sense of realizing, okay, the big bad world is about to arrive. I need to do this, do that, get on a bus, knock on doors, meet people, and start to see what that landscape looks like. And so let's take that as read. That's something that I think nearly everybody recognizes, that the student or the graduate needs to work in that space. They need to do more than just the grades. But given what you've just described about the complexities of the interactions, what people will actually be doing as a practitioner provider, and if you think about your Olympic experience and your football experience, if you were to campaign or suggest a change to a university program that could make space for just a little bit more, what would that be? Because I'm just sensing that you've got to know your stuff. You've got to be able to work with other people. You've got to be able to apply your knowledge, which is a skill set in itself. But then there's the whole complexity of the work environment. And I guess not all of it can be taught. Some of it might have to be supervised or taught outside. What would you suggest if a university program was sort of better supporting a graduate? What would you love to see a little bit further progressed, a little bit further developed before people sort of come out of their formal education?
Again, I think really challenging question, Steve. I think for me, the example I gave earlier on is where I go with this. And I would probably take elements of the UK Sport Fast Track Practitioner Program and I would sandwich those into a postgraduate MSc program. So we're taking a lot of the theoretical knowledge, and like you say, as read, obviously, young practitioners, you have to have the technical knowledge. You have to know to a degree how to apply that. But it's the situations like managing conflict and motivational change and motivational interviewing, how you work in an interdisciplinary way. These were some of the modules that I remember from the fast track program. Another one was having difficult conversations, and I'm sure you remember your early days as well, Steve, those first conversations with coaches where you're actually having to push back. You're the conduit between the coach and the athlete, and your information is landing, and it's really tricky. The first couple of times it feels really awkward, but to have a process and have a confidence in your process to be able to do that, I think is really important. So I would, in my first part is I would condense elements of this fast track program and I would put those into some MSc programs alongside you. Let's say if this is an applied route within the course. So if people know they're going to be applying and being a practitioner, I think there's a pathway there. If it's research, then it might be a slightly different pathway, right? I think the two might fork out. Obviously, as we know, there's strong overlap between the two now, right? You can be a really strong applied researcher and practitioner as well. I think the other thing that I feel quite strongly about as well, Steve, maybe this is on the course, maybe it's just a module. I think that the industry's really spread when it comes to nutrition in terms of career outcomes at the moment, right? And I think across all of the performance sciences. So for example, you might be working in-house at a rugby team, a football team. You might be working in a UK Sports Institute. You might be working as a researcher. But if you're not doing that, there's a lot of people here that are looking to build a business. And a lot of people, a lot of the practitioners that I speak to, and I remember from my early experiences, how do you go about doing that? That thing where someone gave me a really good bit of advice early on, that when you're in a sport and someone's paying for your block of time, your year's service, you're working with an athlete, you're pretty carefree because they know that you're there to deliver the best service to the athlete. And this is great. It's a really different thing when you've got someone on the other side of the table and they're coming to pay an amount to see you. The relationship changes. It could be £1, it could be more, but as soon as the money's changing hands, what you have to deliver to them is value. And how do you go about doing that? How do you demonstrate the value? How are you really clear up front about the deliverables? And I think in terms of small businesses within the UK, this goes across the entire sector, right? I think there needs to be more support for young entrepreneurs coming through and building businesses. But I think definitely this could be touched on more, that if you're building the future, what does it look like in 10 years? Do you want to be in-house? One of the downsides is if you're working within the team, you might be doing lots of traveling. Now, this might be great in the early years, but when you're settling down, having a partner or family, it might not fit as well. So I think some of these outcomes with these roles, and then some support on how to do these, definitely on the business side and how to develop a small business.
That's fascinating. So I want to ask you about that entrepreneurial skill, but going back to that experience that you had as a fast track practitioner program, would it be fair to ask you whether that was the first time you sort of moved out of your comfort zone? And I'm curious. This is informed about I suppose I would see it as a bit of a ball and chain for a lot of universities, that they almost feel like the student satisfaction stops them from challenging, stops them from moving students out of their sort of let's work in the library, then you write it up, then I mark it, and then that's the end of the transaction. Rather than, actually, you know what, today you're going to feel nervous. You're going to feel like you're de-skilled. So tell me, how did it feel? What was that sort of sense of development that you had back then that we need to recreate a little bit more in courses?
Well, I think in terms of being outside of the comfort zone, I would say, if I'm really honest, going back a step, that I was trying to do that for myself at doing these roles in the summer
Okay.
before getting the fast track practitioner program. But I think I could almost see on the horizon that there were limited jobs, and essentially I had to be ahead of the people in my group. That was really important. So I think from that point, stepping out was important. In terms of technically, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. A few of these courses, I think what the thing they did really well, I think at the start was framing what you're moving into. And I think that just works wonders, right, Steve? Because the one thing we knew was over the course of this year, you're going to be put in difficult situations. And I think because we knew up front, it's this year is all about learning. They said that mistakes are okay. You're going to be challenged at times. You're going to feel really uncomfortable at times. I think we were ready for it. And I definitely think my year group, there were 4 nutrition interns. There was obviously Kev Carroll, who you know well, Mark Ellis, and Navari Keel. We were in the same year, and we can almost work together as well and share these experiences. But we knew we were going to be challenged. And I think when you know challenge is coming, it's easier to accept and throw yourself into that. When it's just the unknown, you don't know whether it should feel right or not. But again, this is probably coming back to this mentorship, technical supervision, support, whether this is done by an organization or a mentor, such as the UK Sports Institute, whether it's done, such as our consultancy or a sport. I think having this overarching support early on is so important.
Mm. And you mentioned there a key word about value, and that sense of how it actually feels quite different when you're charging somebody directly for your time, and that sharpens the focus on you delivering value. Is is the assumption there that maybe you're not as value focused if you've got the comfort of a salary? If you are perhaps the exchange or the discussion with a coach or an athlete doesn't go that well, oh well, never mind. Or the trouble with them is it gives you an excuse not to necessarily review and refine your work. Is that what you're implying there a little bit?
The relationship changes for sure, and I'm sure you'll feel the same with your work as well, Steve. That part of having the private practice initially, and I'm probably fast forwarding a couple of steps here. I was working in house at Arsenal, and delivering there, and then suddenly you're on Harley Street and you're delivering with clients, and firstly you're thinking, well, actually, what is the value of the service I'm providing? Where is this mapped with other services on Harley Street? What's my practitioner level? What's my competency? And also what are the deliverables that I can give to the client? And you're going through a bit of a journey earlier on to actually pitch your service at the right level. But for sure, I remember the first couple of consultations, I'm thinking, is it worth it? Are they going to turn around and say, James, what, I'm paying X, for this service? No, I'm not paying for it. There's always part of you until you've tested something, you're never quite sure. And I'm saying that because everyone goes through this process. I remember at the start with the early clients, we're testing the model for sure as well, because we're applying a lot of what we've learned in sport to the general public, which at the time was quite unknown. And then we've obviously got the business side too. But in answer to your question, Steve, it does change the relationship. And I think for me, for the better. I think having a private practice or having one foot or having an interest outside of sports, I think there are learnings that kind of cross pollinate. So, for example, I think the business side outside of sport helps you to understand what it's like to build a caseload, what it's like to charge clients, what's the business structure you might need to build. And then vice versa as well. I think there are skills from that you bring into the sports as well, around your time management, for example. The one thing is if you've got the clock on you for a consultation and it's an hour and you've got 8 clients in that day, you're damn sure you're going to run to
Yeah.
the hour. You're not going to overlap at all. Whereas sometimes in sport, obviously, it can be at times more fluid. But I think there are elements from your professional practice that you can bring in to your sports practice as well. And that's definitely something that I felt strongly about.
Yeah, and to sort of come back to your question about where do I think things are at, I think that there is a clear opportunity for everybody to play a greater role in this game, whether it's the universities, whether it's business, whether it's the industry of professional teams or Olympic teams, for example, but equally governing bodies, whether that is the skill set, the accreditation systems that need to modernize. I'm thoughtful of a team that I had to work with during the pandemic who had financial instability because of the pandemic. Sponsorships were unstable, for example, and and we had to revise the composition of a support team across different disciplines. And I'm thoughtful of the nutritionist in that team, who was 5 days a week and who went down to 3 days a week. And it meant then that that team not only had less resource to tap into, but that person had potentially had the threat of losing a little bit of livelihood. And so there was a need for me to support and revise and sort of think about the model for optimizing the team within a certain budget. But then what was really nice about that was that the team manager wanted to provide them with some support to help set up their business, give them that type of mentoring support that I could provide to them. That was just an example of how the industry is changing, it's adapting. The needs that were relevant yesterday are changing all the time, about what we need to sort of gear up for. So, yeah, okay, interesting.
It's a really important point you touch on there, Steve. And if I may, I'll jump in because I think we need to recognize as well from a nutrition perspective, nutrition isn't as far along, it isn't at the table as much as sports science, as as much as physiotherapy for sure, medical for sure, strength and conditioning for sure. If you look at all of the evidence that FIFA has published from around the world, the lowest full-time equivalents are psychology and nutrition, and that's really known. And actually, one of the things we need to think about with nutrition is it's still in its infancy in terms of the research. It's still in its infancy in terms of developing its own practice as well. So, and I'm definitely thinking in terms of some team sports and particularly football here that, you're totally right. Unfortunately, sometimes when there's a cut or when there's a budgetary pinch point, sometimes it is nutrition that needs to go. But I'm always really mindful in the conversations that we have with different federations and confederations as well, just to really listen and where they pitch nutrition as well, because I think sometimes within our own industry, we can see our own thing in a certain way, right? Or we can have a certain bias towards our discipline. It's sometimes really interesting to get medical's perspective on your discipline or commercially where it sits as well, or from an overall performance perspective. But there's no doubt as a discipline, nutrition, we're making great strides and it's moving forward. We've got more practitioners on the ground now, which is great. But I think we're always just really mindful of there's a lot of work to do in terms of full-time equivalents. And one of the things we need to do to have those is to have an impact. That's the only thing. If we're having an impact and we're demonstrating a return on investment for that sport and the sport is feeling it, it's going to mean there's more budget flowing down towards nutrition and create more jobs. So I'm always really mindful of this sort of macroeconomic landscape for performance sciences and definitely how nutrition fits within that.
And how's that done?
In what sense, Steve?
What would be the way in which you'd create the business case? Is that where there is greater evidence of impact that proves the point? That means that you can get from there's a problem with that athlete, go and see them. So that bolt-on type service versus the proactive, integrating, perhaps removing some of the decision-making aspects of choice in nutrition. What's the way in which you'd love to see this progress in the future?
Well, I think for us, there's a couple of pieces here. The first piece is around understanding, around stakeholder management and understanding. So an example I've given a couple of times recently is obviously we have different generations of coaches and players now. One of the things that we're seeing at the moment is we're now seeing, let's say, for example, within Olympic sports, definitely within football and team sports as well, athletes who practitioners, when we were working within the institute and that sort of age, when they were players, they're now coaches, they're now sporting directors. So what that means is if they've had a good exposure as a player and good understanding, it's now more important to them, and I can think of a few prominent managers now we've worked with on the way through, and it's really shaped their ethos and philosophy around performance and around how nutrition fits in. So I think that stakeholder management is absolutely crucial as well. And I think there's a really nice opportunity for that. I think the other thing as well that we need to do, Steve, if I'm honest, is create to build evidence. To really build evidence in terms of how we're having an impact. So, for example, with a business project that we're working on at the moment, a really important thing for us as a business is to create evidence, in terms of the impact we're having. And that might be through the competencies of the different staff that we're working with. So, for example, one of the things that we tend to do is that the different tools or actions that we put in place for staff, we are actually asked them to capture the evidence of them applying these things. So it's something that we can build, and it might be videos, it might be other things as well. But when we're feeding these back to the organization, the evidence is there for all to see. And in a way, I think it's a similar thing in sports. What we're looking to try and do is we're looking for our athletes to demonstrate competencies. And what I don't mean by that is they can answer questions in a quiz. What I'm meaning by this is we're working with athletes, coaching them, we're having lots of touch points, so that in situations that are more stressful, maybe around competition, around matches, the performance staff, the executive are clearly seeing that they are using our strategies and using them well. This might be really clear to a fitness coach who's traveling with a team, that on match day, they can see that through the understanding and trialing of these different strategies, athletes are asking for these. I think one sport that did this really well, Steve, if I'm honest, is track and field. And I'm almost thinking back to some of our work then. One of the things that we would see with the athletes is they would be great at taking on board the strategies and being really clear with their race timeline for the day, when they're fueling, when they're activating, warming up, when they're hydrating, all of these different factors. It was really clear and tangible. And I think actually with a lot of the work with the sport, we need to try and find ways, and sometimes be quite inventive, to show our competency, because again, the more we can demonstrate that, the more the sport is going to say, hey, look, if I'm investing X in a service, we can potentially start to map out our return on investment. That's a more complex model, but we need to be having the conversations around that.
It's a great answer, and I think that idea of evidence is probably pervasive. Show me that it works. Show me it's worth my time. Show me that I've got a return from that. I'm curious, and I was just thinking of athletics as you were as you were explaining that, but there tends to be a high level of literacy in the area. People will know maybe what glycogen depletion really feels like. They will have periods of time where they are injured because they're pushing the boundary, so that they know that there's something that they can do whilst they're injured around their nutrition. There is a literacy around that in that sport most of the times. What's been your experience of being able to build that culture of acceptance? This is as much as anything, because nutrition is an emotive thing for a lot of people in business, in football, in Olympic sport. What have you been encountering when you've gone into those environments, and what are the things that you're looking for that informs your strategy and your approach about how you bring that to life?
And this is Steve, around the culture of the individuals, or around building the culture to take a team forward?
I know it's a big question, isn't it? Thank you for dividing it further, but it's what both. If you could address that.
So if we can unpack this slightly, then, so let's have a look then. Firstly, a team approach, and what I would say is, within a team sport, I always say we have two trains running. We have the team strategies. So, for example, I use football because I think it's an example I think probably a lot of your listeners will understand, in terms of the environment. But obviously what we tend to have is we have different strategies for different days. There might be a match day -1, And on match day -1, there'll be almost like a set routine around training. So it means we can advise around nutrition on that day. Same with the match day. There'll be a plan throughout the day in terms of travel, in terms of nutrition, in terms of team meetings, in terms of the performance itself, in terms of recovery, a really nice flow. So at a team level, one of the things that we're trying to do is put in place really strong protocols for all of the team to follow, which encapsulates the whole of the squad and takes them through. Now, obviously, those are on different days. Within the training environment, there's different monitoring and testing. Let's not go on to those for the moment. But within that, we've got teams of individuals, right? We've got a lot of nuance here, because the second part of this is that, let's say you're working in the Premier League at the moment. If you're working in the Premier League, we know that approximately 60% of players are expatriate. 60%, pretty big number. I mean, this is grown since the mid-90s, since the Bosman ruling. We've seen more and more free migration of players. So this will mean that if you're working with a first team squad in the Premier League, you might be dealing with 16 nationalities at minimum, maybe up to 20 different nationalities. It's a big ask, isn't it? I think if we said to someone in a business context, for someone to work in that way, it's a big ask there. So how do we go about, working with them? Well, I think there's a couple of really interesting points. And I think the first thing is we're trying to set up a couple of things. The first is working in a way which empowers the players. So we're trying to get to players to understand why they're doing things. And this is really important, understanding the why, because as soon as players understand the why, like you said in track and field, which the athletes did really well, there's more chance that they're going to apply it. For example, composition of the pre-match meal. Why am I eating these foods? Why am I eating it at this time? What's the reasoning that's given to the player? If, for example, let's use a really small example here. Someone's during the winter is taking a vitamin D supplement. What's that doing? What does it look like? What's the function? Why are you taking it at that time of day? Because otherwise, what we tend to see and what we need to try and avoid is, for example, a supplement just looks like a pill. To a player, you're giving a player a few different supplements. Unless they really understand, you're giving them a couple of different types of pill. Now, obviously, that's quite problematic. So I think for us, it's trying to set up a culture where we understand about the player, we're trying to work with them, and we're trying to help them develop their own strategies, helping them to co-create these strategies. And this is probably coming on to a bigger point here, Steve. The two key things I'm kind of swimming into now are, number one, that players take ownership for their nutrition. So, for example, whether it's a match day, whether it's a training day, we really need to strike the balance as practitioners of educating, upskilling, then stepping back and allowing the players to execute the strategies themselves. Sometimes the tendency can be to step forward. And if we are stepping forward, it can smother the players at times. We're desperate to have an impact potentially as practitioners. So it's really important for us, we set up a nice process where we're advising the players, letting the players implement, and then also feeding back. And this is coming on to my second point here, Steve, as well. One of the challenges that we have with nutrition historically is that with athletes, it was often seen as a bit of a one-stop shop. And what I mean by that is you go and see a nutritionist for a plan. Okay, what's my training nutrition plan? What's my plan for match day, etc. It's really important, going back to this word framing, that at the start of the journey, we're working with the squad as a whole and with individual players, and we're saying, hey, look, this is how we're going to apply nutrition. The relationship that you and I are going to have is one where we're working together, but it's an iterative process. So what I expect from you is we might sit down and have a meeting for 10 minutes because the thing that we're working on is your recovery post-match. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with you to see about what's the strategy you're going to try this weekend. You might try it in training first of all, try it this weekend. You're then going to feed back to me. How did it go from your perspective? We're going to speak to the other performance science team. What data do we have to support your subjective view? And then when we can say, well, look, do we need to tweak this further, or is that now stuck? Okay, so we might be happy with that. We might then move on to another area. It might be around sleep. It might be around travel. There are lots of these different scenarios that I believe over a period of time we're working through with our athletes. But it's really important we frame that it's an iterative process to them so they understand this. It's not a passive process where we give them a plan, where we plate up the food, where we give them a shake of some description. It's really important that it's a two-way conversation, I think.
Okay, so I've heard over the years about this kind of the rise of the performance chef and nutritionists working with the catering staff, which feels smart. Provide you with a selection of options, and within that range, that margin, you're not going to go far wrong. And then potentially that there's private chefs that are taking the decision making out, effectively plating things up and providing good, nutritious, and hopefully tasty food for people who can afford that type of level of service. But my concern over the years hearing that is that doesn't empower the athlete. And you're still saying that's important. You're still saying we do need to do the education so that they connect with it at a deeper level, so that they're motivated and focused on taking those daily actions that they need to perform and to recover and to optimize themselves.
Yeah, I'm saying absolutely that, Steve. Yeah, and what I'm not saying is that each individual will have a different way that they set up their food service. Some athletes and players will have private chefs. That's absolutely great. Some will have partners that will cook for them. Absolutely great. Some will cook for themselves, whichever really works for that environment. But whatever happens, whoever's preparing food in a club or a training environment or at home, it's still really important that the player or the athlete is part of that decision-making process. Because there's times where, and this is the classic example for me, if we take football as an example again, because it's quite an easy one to apply here. Let's say you're a Premier League player. You've got a really nice home environment set up. You've got your chef that comes in and prepares the food. Food at the training ground's great. Different products are laid out. You've got a really nice structure. However, what happens then when you're on international duty during Copa America? I can guarantee you the setup's different. So you're having then to take ownership on these things, your traveling strategy, how are you preparing for the match? What food are you eating as well? So it's really important, and this comes back to this empowerment piece, that the athlete is driving this process. And I think performance chefs can work really well. All of these things can work really well, but it's just always really important the athlete's in the middle of it.
And tell me a little bit about your work with musicians then. So what's the approach there? What's the demand? Now, I'm just assuming that as someone who didn't quite make it for football, but probably sounds quite handy on a park, you had a clear understanding of what the demands of modern day football are. But talk to me a little bit about that work, because that sounds like an interesting opportunity, not only for impact, but also incredible opportunity to branch performance nutrition to a different industry.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, Steve. I actually still remember the phone call I got when the first musician that we really worked with in depth. And again, I won't name names on this, but in terms of the profile of the musician, I had a call, a prominent musician who was going to headline Glastonbury, headline the Pyramid stage at Glastonbury, which for a musician is the biggest accolade. If you're playing on a headline gig. And I said, look, would you be interested in meeting? There's some work here to be done around nutrition. I said, well, yeah, absolutely. This is great. And it was only then sitting down with the musician and understanding their goals and process that it was so similar to the work we do with an athlete. There were certain questions that were bubbling up. Some of these questions were, hey, look, on the night, so on the performance night, it's going to be a longer set. The set's going to be more energetic. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so there's going to be an element of improving physical capacity, improving in fitness coming into this. So that was a really interesting point, first of all. We also know that when you're playing under the lights, there's something around here, the temperature on the night as well, and the ambient temperature that we'd expect for that performance at that time of year with Glastonbury. So again, there's an interesting question, but also leading up to that, whilst improving fitness, there was a question around body composition. and how that wanted to look as well alongside the training. So before you know it, we've actually got quite a lot of components here that are really very similar to the way we work with athletes, but with one really key difference. It's not elite sport, it's music. And I think that contextual side of things was something I was quite aware of early on. And I think for me, it was really trying to understand the culture of this particular genre of music. And I think that was really important. So I think at the start, Steve, it was about a lot of listening, straight away, because I think even in our first initial meetings, even the way with some of the terminology we used or we refer to, let's say, the day of the performance versus the match day, there were lots of different things that were going to be obviously very different. There's time in the studio. What does that time look like? Is it as structured as sport? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So I think for me, there was a real deep dive, I would say, over a few weeks to really try and understand not just the performer, but their ecosystem. Who do they have around them as well? Management, tour staff. What does a tour look like? What food's available? So I think for me, the process was very similar. That was really easy. The contextual side was something deliberately I really wanted to ease into. And I just asked lots of questions and probably not pretend that I knew the environment, because I didn't know the environment. So being, I think, really clear that, hey, look, I have expertise in this space. I'm going to look to apply it. Let's talk. I've got tons of questions for you. I'm really interested to hear about this, this, and this. And I remember actually really landed for me, Steve. I remember going to see a couple of the rehearsals, and it was real hairs on the back of your neck stuff, standing up. And I think it was only really then, and seeing how the whole production came together, you think, okay, this is really very interesting. I wonder how we can apply our service and actually make it more and more nimble, because I probably haven't quite got it to this point. Now we've got a bit more work to do before the main event.
Amazing. And that type of performance, and thinking about what determines effective performance, what goes into the preparation for that, the support team around that, but also what could be the hijacks around that. I'm sure I've no doubt you'd be putting an immune support system pack in there around preventing or doing what you can to minimize the chances of upper respiratory tract infections, because that's going to kibosh a voice, isn't it? I guess I'm just freestyling now.
Yeah, no, you're entirely right. And I think this is part of a risk management for any client that you take on. And the process is the same, Steve, right? We're working backwards from that day, from that big day. And it's exactly the same for me. I think there's a real likeness here, less so with team sport, but there's a real likeness that, let's say back in the day, we had an athlete going to the world champs. I mean, I think, what was it, 2007 was Osaka, let's say. I think my memory serves me correctly.
Mm-hmm.
You've got an athlete peaking probably for 6 months going into that event. And the training, the detail, the rest, the recovery, all of these things have to be going right, because if it's slightly wrong on the day, the whole thing's in jeopardy. So I would say there's a really strong likeness, maybe more so to the musician and some of our Olympic athletes rather than the team sport athletes.
Yeah. So many different insights from across the different ranges there. It strikes me as though the common thread is there staying curious and being open to asking good questions, understanding the culture, working with the people around you, as opposed to coming in with just a copybook of this is the way I do my work. And it sounds like that's not only been central to your work, but also it's quite universal approach to the executive market, to musicians, to sport team or Olympic over the years, how you've built your career.
Yeah, I think that's right, Steve. I think the curiosity is really important. I think probably the transparency. I use this word transparency. I think that's really important. We use that a lot within our team, just about being really transparent about what you do know and what you don't know. And I think that's whether we're working with someone outside. I had conversation with a practitioner I worked with the other day. We work very closely. And we just say, hey, look, we'll challenge each other. And we have a relationship. We work really hard to challenge each other. So again, we frame this relationship. We've said to get the most from each other, we're going to make each other feel difficult at times, but we're really comfortable with that. And if we don't know the answer, we'll say, and we'll go and get that answer. And I think it's probably just this realization, and to reinforce that within a sports setting, you don't have to know all the answers. That's impossible. So don't put your pressure on yourself to do that. But if you don't, you need to have people around you that you can ask and help improve and learn that knowledge as well. So I think that's an important element.
Mm. Superb, James. Love chatting to you, and I'm just curious to know what's next for you. INTRA is start to establish. Where do you go next?
It's a really interesting question, and probably relatively timely as well, Steve. So I think for us in INTRA, we've got a foothold now. We've got a nice team, and I'm really looking for us to increase, our work. A big focus for us is within individual athletes, individual players, as I mentioned, and to work really closely with national federations and clubs to get the communication right around this pathway as well. So that's one aspect for us that's really important. And I think the other side is, how can we continue to learn within business, and how can we continue to apply nutrition in different ways? And going back to this word of impact, how can we demonstrate our impact in this setting where within corporate wellness, it's traditionally been a bit more difficult? For me personally, I've just actually embarked on a new venture that I'm working in now, and that is working within investments. So I'm going to almost be now working with an investment group to help looking at forthcoming performance ventures as well, to understand what's going to have an impact on society, what's going to have an impact right across the board. So I'm really interested in that next step as well. This is alongside INTRA, but I think for me, Steve, one of the big drivers is working on projects that will have a big impact for individuals, but is always, how can we improve our ecosystem of performance and also wider society? So essentially, how can we answer big questions and work with trusted people to do those?
Amazing. Sounds like a challenge in itself for you, but an opportunity for personal growth, but much wider impact, as you allude to there. So that sounds like an incredible next few years ahead for you, James. Thank you so much for spending the time to chat to me. Great to catch up after all these years. A real shot of clear thinking that I've enjoyed from you over the years. So thank you so much.
That's my pleasure, Steve. And the next time it'll be a coffee down in London now.
Yeah, coffee down in that at the Arsenal training ground, maybe. Yeah, fantastic.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me on, Steve.